Although it's very easy to use the link data source control to connect a control to a database, you can also use the link code you learned in Lesson 10.3 to do the same thing. Using C# instead of data source controls is helpful when you need more flexibility on your pages. For example, you can use if statements to return different sets of data depending on different conditions. You'll see how useful this can be in Lesson 12.6. To begin this lesson, open the Spark sample file from your Sample Files folder. And open reports.aspx in Design View. Now, delete the Link Data Source Invoice control. You're going to connect the database to the Grid View control manually, so you don't need the Link Data Source control anymore. Next, remove the Data Source property from the Grid View control. Simply remove the text from the Data Source ID property so that it is blank. Click No when prompted to refresh the Grid View controls fields. We are now going to add C# code to retrieve the data. Open the code behind file of reports.aspx. Now, add the following code to the page load event handler. Using Spark data context data equals new Spark data context var invoices equals data.invoices.orderby invoice lambda invoice.invoice date. This code retrieves the contents of the invoices table sorted by invoice date and places it into a collection called invoices. Now we're going to bind the data to the Grid View control. Add the following code on the next line. Grid View invoice.dataSource equals invoices. This provides the Grid View control with the data returned by link. Since the invoice objects all have names that correspond to the items in the table, the columns that were automatically generated by the link data source control earlier will continue to work without any problems. If you were to use data from a different table, you would have to set up your Grid View controls columns to match the new table. Now, add the following code on the next line. Grid View invoice.dataBind. Without this line, the data will not appear in the control. Whenever you change a control's data source property, you must call the dataBind method before the new data will be displayed. Note that you can bind data to any control that has a data source property by using this technique. The data you bind to your controls doesn't have to be created by link. You can use any collection as a data source. Now, let's see the code in action. View the page in your browser. As you can see, your C# code successfully retrieves the data. Now click Edit, Delete, or one of the page numbers. As you can see, there is an exception. Without the link data source control to handle these events, they will not work. The easiest way to allow editing and deleting of records in a grid view is to use a link data source control. If you bind data to your control manually, as you have in this lesson, you can still use the automatic functions by adding row editing and row deleting event handlers. You'll learn more about this topic in the Expert Skills course in this series. Close your web browser now. To enable your grid view to use paging, you can create your own Page Index Changing event handler. Open reports.aspx in Design View and add a Page Index Changing event handler to the grid view control. Now, add the following code to the new event handler. Grid view invoice dot page index equals e dot new page index grid view invoice dot data bind. This will enable the paging features to work. Note that an object called e is often passed into an event handler as an argument. In this case, the new page index property of the e object must be provided to the grid view control in order for it to move to the next page. Note that since the link code in this lesson is in the page load event handler, the database will be queried every time the page posts back. On this page, that isn't a problem, but it's inefficient to re-query the database if the data hasn't changed. You can make your queries more efficient by using an if statement along with the page.isPostback property. You'll make use of this technique in Lesson 12.8. You've now completed Lesson 11.8, Bind Data to a Control using C#.